I'm building a 2-trailer tiny house. It's been a bloody long time, but we've got some floors in, so it's time for a build update. So I know it's been a while since the last build update, but sometimes life just gets in the way. I did divert myself to another project for a while, which meant this thing has stood still, which is pretty frustrating, but someone's got to pay the bills for this damn thing. In fact, it was a really cool project. It was this automated coffee bean loader that sucks coffee beans up off of a pallet and weighs it off into drums. I'd love to do a video on it sometime, so if I do, I'll link it in the video. But for now, I'm back onto the house, finally making some progress. The floors are in, and you definitely want to check these out. So let's go have a look. So I originally got the idea for making my own floors when I was making the doors and windows. As I was machining up the timbers, I was getting all of these really thin offcuts. When I started looking into flooring, I was probably going to use a floating floor or something like that. And what I realized was that's basically just plywood with a veneer on top. So I thought, why couldn't I just take these, veneer them down onto my floor and make my own flooring? And I like that idea because it meant to be really lightweight. This is going to be the thickness of my floor. In fact, thinner by the time I sand it. It'll be stuck down directly to my floor. It won't move easy, and it's going to look beautiful. I can pull it off. Also, I find engineered flooring, even if you get the flooring with real timber on top, it just looks too perfect. It almost looks plastic. So I really like being able to work with my own timber, having imperfections in the floor, you know, some joints that aren't quite perfect, some imperfections in the timber. I really wanted, I guess, a more natural look, and I wanted to be able to oil my floor. So I decided I would try and prototype it. So over the last year, I've been prototyping different boards where I'm direct sticking the timber down onto OSB. And then I've been sitting it in their house here, been sitting it in the sun, seeing how it handles, being walked across all day. So as I've been building the house, I've just been walking across these samples and then seeing what happens with the sun, if the boards will lift up off the floor, etc. Because one of the problems I had is direct sticking these down. These veneers, because they're so thin but have a large surface area, are really prone to cupping. So that's where they sort of can cup like this and become bowed or even twist. And I wanted to make sure that if I'm going to stick them down to the floor, that sticking down onto the OSB is going to be enough to hold them down through all of the elements. A lot of sun comes into these windows as the moisture changes throughout the year. One of the processes was to work out what adhesive I could use. There were some really good adhesives, but they were just a bit too toxic and had a lot of VOC, particularly for this space. I ended up settling on a flooring polyurethane, ironically, which turned out to be really good. It's given really good surface adhesion, but also allows the timber as it expands and contracts to move independent of the subsurface without creating any problems or breaking that bond. So the first step was to machine up all the timber. A lot of the offcuts I had were pretty rough and ready. They had a lot of tear out on the edges and the edges were rounded. So the first thing I did was to go through and grade all the pieces of timber. I had to make sure they're going to be thick enough for when I stick them down and sand them, there's enough material left, but also picking which had the best face. So I went through, graded them one by one, and then put them through the thicknesser to try and bring them down all down to the same thickness, but also try and get a nice smooth face to be working with. Next, I had to machine up those edges. Luckily, I've got a mate who's a cabinet maker and had a panel saw big enough to do it. It's got a big sled on it, which allowed me to clamp down the board, run it through and straighten up one edge, and then run them back through again and make all the boards exactly the same width. So with all the timber machined up, it was time to start planning to lay down the floor. Now, I thought this was going to be a quick process, but it turns out I only just had enough timber to do the floor, which meant I really couldn't have any offcuts. So I had to go through and dry lay the floor to make sure I've got the best use of all the pieces without having too many offcuts. But also, I didn't want a floor that looked like a patchwork. I wanted to look like a really nice floor. I didn't want joints too close together, and also that I could put the nicest looking boards in the center of the house because the boards vary quite a bit in character. That turned out to be a painstaking process where I hand laid every single piece, trimming it up as I go, numbering everyone throughout the whole house. Now, that was a pain in the butt. I normally wouldn't go to that level of effort, but it actually made laying the boards easier because I'd already squared off all the edges, cut all the boards to length, they were numbered, and I knew exactly where they had to go. With the boards all dry laid, it was time to start gluing, but this is where it got a little bit complicated. I need to remember that about a third of my floor actually lifts up and it needs to look like an integrated part of the floor. what I realized was the center panel of my lift up floor, if I adjusted it a little bit, it actually was exactly 6 boards wide, which meant I could put the flooring down on it and the joint of the floor panels would actually line up with the joint of the floorboards that sit on top of it, which then hides the joint in my floor panels. And I tell you what, that has worked really well. But that meant I needed to start my floor from the center and work out, not just work back from an edge. And that was a bit of a pain in the butt. So I started off by gluing that center panel first. I could then use that as a reference to lay the board through the center of the main trailer. Now, the problem with this stuff is I'm not nailing any of this down as I go. So I'm just bedding it down into the glue, and I need to hold that in place while the glue sets so that the boards don't move around, the joints open up, etc. So I had to put a reference line down on the floor where I could put all my boards hard up against, and then once I'd laid them, clamp them from the other side by wedging in some timber to hold that center row perfectly in place. So I worked through spreading the polyurethane, laying the boards down. I could then put the wedging pieces in, and then on top of that, I laid some structure floor and then put sandbags down on the top of it. Now, the reason I've done sandbag is because these boards are really reactive to moisture and sun. So they lift and they cup and they twist. So by weighting them down, it made sure that the boards adhered down to my OSB flooring nice and flat, but also to bed them down into the adhesive to making sure I'm getting a really good coverage between the board and the OSB that sits underneath. With the center row done, I could then work my way out to the edges. So I worked from the center row, spreading adhesive and then laying the boards out to the wall, wedging them off of the walls to keep them in place, and doing the same thing again with sandbags. So one of the problems I had was I wasn't sure how to bring these floorboards from the main trailer through into here, into the side trailer. The problem I've got is these floor panels here are actually floating. They're fixed up on the main trailer side, but on this side can float depending how well these trailers are lined up. That could mean if I line up these floorboards, they could end up out of alignment. And I really didn't want that to happen. Anyway, I spent some time trying to work out, do I make the boards perpendicular, which means the boards don't flow into the side trailer here, or do I line them up and see how it goes? I did some tests and I think I can generally line the house up pretty well and get these within a few millimeters. But also this join between the floating floors here and the floor in the main house here are actually going to have a brass cover strip over it. So that will break the visual line of the lines coming through into here. Now, the other problem I had with the floating floor panels was how I joined the floor onto the main trailer. On the side trailer there, I've got a wall over half of it and then some brass tread plates are going to go on the door. But here, it's right in the middle of the house, right in the middle of the floor. So what I did was I capped the boards with some brass angle. So I got a piece of brass angle going across the main trailer here, and then across the end of the floor panels, I put brass on them as well. So now when they meet up, I get this nice sharp line of brass that just goes through the middle of my floor. That actually looks quite nice. In fact, it's become more of a feature than an eyesore. Now, the other thing I did was to continue my boards across the brass strip here. So very few boards have actually terminated at the brass. By doing that, the grain continues across the brass so that it looks like the boards are just continuing through the house, and it doesn't draw the eye to the fact that I've got a join here. And that's actually something that I did in the bedroom as well, so that the floorboards flowed seamlessly through the house. So then here in the side trailer, because I was trying to line up the boards with what was in the main house, I had to put down a reference board again and work back from that as opposed to walking from the end of the wall. So I laid this in sections again, working off that reference point, slowly working my way through to the end wall until I had the whole bedroom done. Now, while the gluing process went surprisingly smooth, it wasn't without its dramas. A couple of the boards hadn't fully adhered down properly. This happened because my boards sort of varied in thickness a little bit, and the thinner ones I was back buttering, but a couple hadn't quite adhered properly, and so that made them reactive to moisture and could lift up at the edges. So I had to rip them out and glue in new ones. And this was a painful process, but I tell you what, it gave me confidence that when those boards are stuck down in that adhesive, they're not coming off. So with all the floors laid down, I left them for a couple of days to make sure the adhesive was well cured, and then it was time to sand. And this was an interesting process. If you've ever used a drum sander before, you'll know these things are unforgiving. You can't stop ever with them because you've got this spinning drum with pretty coarse sandpaper on there, and it'll eat into the floor. And in such a small space here, I really didn't have much room to work. Sometimes when I'm going up to the wall, I've only got like a meter to move back behind me, so I had to be pretty on the ball to make sure I lift up that sander as I stop moving. Now, because my boards were pretty uneven, and that's because there was different thickness boards and variation in the gluing process, I first had to level the floor. So I started off by going 45-degree angles across the grain with a really coarse grit. And this just tore away the floor, but it allowed me to work across the floor and bring the down to a consistent level pretty quickly. After that, I shifted to going with the grain, where I worked along the length of the boards and working my way down in grits, but getting progressively finer until I got to 120 grit. It was then time to get really messy. the belt sander random orbit sander created so much more dust than the behemoth of a drum sander. Anyway, first of all, I had to do the bedroom, where I couldn't get up sides of the bed there with the drum sander. I had to do that with a belt sander, which was a long, tedious job that created an obscene amount of dust. Afterwards, I then had to go around all of the edges of the floor where I couldn't get up to the walls with the drum sander, sanding up to the edges with the belt sander and the random orbit sander, getting all the floor sanded back ready for oiling. So the last thing I did before oiling was to fill some of the sap veins in this timber with resin. Now, I didn't get too carried away with this because, to be honest, I love the natural character of the veins that are in a Victorian ash. But some of them were a little bit too big, so I did have to fill them. And in the doorway there, where you're coming in with moisture, I really didn't want the moisture being able to get through those veins into the timber too easily. Now, it was kind of hard to mix up the right color resin for this because the sap is kind of this sort of semi-translucent, dark gray color. What I ended up going with was to mix sawdust into the resin and then a tiny bit of black to just tint it down a little bit, and it gave a really good color. In fact, walking over this floor, you can't tell that most of these sap veins have been filled unless you look really closely. So I'm really happy with how it came out. Now, you might ask, why didn't I do the resin before I sanded, which would have been the smart idea? Simply, I didn't have the resin yet. So it was a bit of a pain in the butt to go and put the resin in after I've sanded, because I had to be really careful not to drop resin on the rest of the floor and sort of how put it into the veins. But luckily I didn't drop too much, and around where I filled all of these sap veins, it's sanded up beautifully, so it looks really good. So when it came to finishes, I went back and forth on this forever. I really wanted to oil the timber because I love how it looks and it matched my windows, but I was leaning towards a polyurethane because it was going to be better wearing, particularly because you come straight from outside with water, muddy boots straight into the house. Not that we're putting muddy boots on this floor. Polyurethane was going to give me a better protection because it puts a film over the top. Anyway, I did a heap of research and I thought, bugger it, I really want to oil. So I ended up going with the Rolls Royce in oils, which is Osmo PolyX, which is a blend of waxes and oils that just looks amazing. And they claim that it gets pretty close to polyurethane and wear. Now, I don't know about that, but one benefit of oiling the timber is it can be patch repaired. So if a part of the floor gets damaged, I can repair just that part and put oil down on top of it, as opposed to polyurethane where I need to strip the floor. Now, I tell you what, this stuff just went down amazing. The benefit of oils is instead of sitting as a plastic layer on top of the grain, it actually penetrates the grain, which means it wets the fiber of the grain and brings it to life. And I tell you what, laying the oil down on this floor is easy top 3 moments of building this entire house. It was probably the most satisfying thing I've done, and I would go back and do this time and time again just for the joy of doing it. To lay the oil was really simple. In fact, it goes on really thin, which is kind of strange for an oil, but all I needed was a microfiber roller where I worked along the length of the grain, working across the boards, working into the grain of the timber without building it up too much. You then let that set for like 8 to 12 hours and then come back and do a second coat. Once that dries, you get this beautiful sort of low sheen satin finish on the timber. But the beauty of it is when you touch and you look at this timber, it's real timber. There's no plastic film on top of it. I love that. And it just looks like a real floor. You get this natural feel of timber throughout the house. And because it's an oil, the grain just dances, and man, does it look good. So that's the floors done. I tell you what, that's not getting old. I can't tell you how good it is to finally have these floors down, particularly because the biggest challenge I had with sort of bringing this interior together is the fact that these trailers are joined. And these floating floor panels were something kind of kept me up at night because I didn't really know how to lay a floor down on these panels in a meaningful way that looked nice. But direct sticking like timber veneer down onto the floor has worked amazing. I've been able to hide the joins of the floor panels except for where there's brass here, but the brass has become this beautiful feature in the middle of my floor. The floor just flows beautifully all the way throughout the house and looks amazing. I'm really happy with the result. The next steps is actually to start lining the interior, which I can't tell you how excited I am by that, because it's been going so long, and now that I'm actually starting to put final finishes on, the house is taking shape. So I've got heaps of work to do, but the good news is I'm back on the house and making it happen, and I'm pretty excited to start lining the interior of this house. You guys know the drill. Don't hate, educate. Comment down below if you see something this video can be improved, or you've got any questions about how to do the floor. In the meantime, go build cool stuff. I'll see you guys again soon.